All right, I'm going to start this film here. This is a little documentary that I watched here about 5, 6 years ago. And it's about other shots that were fired prior to what was documented with the commission there, bullshit commission. And in this film, I had the opportunity when I was 13 years old. Robert Kennedy was campaigning in California the end of May and early part of June, and there was a special on KCOP Channel 13 of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which was Robert Kennedy's brother. And for the first time, Geraldo Rivera said this is the first time it's ever been shown. Well, that's not true. The first time I ever seen the complete, and even the Geraldo Rivera's special he did, does not show the complete Zapruder film. I actually only saw it once. That was in 1968. And it's the complete film of JFK in the limousine coming around the corner and coming down Elm Street, turning from Houston to Elm Street non-stop. If you watch that film now, they try to make this stuff up that, oh, he shut the camera off. John Zapruder said he never shut his camera off. So there's a BS there. But with that all being said, I had the opportunity of watching only once, 13 years old, it's about a week or two before Robert F. Kennedy got assassinated, of seeing the complete film uncut. And the same results show up in that film of Kennedy leaning over to his left from the limousine. Something occurred as he made that turn. And this guy here did some research and pretty much found out what took place, what happened in that turn. So let me go ahead and start this up and check this one out. This guy did some good research.
But in her film, we get a glimpse of a little 13-year-old girl who was doing a much better job of operating her movie camera. Her name was Tina Towner, and that brings us to the first question we'll be trying to resolve. Over the years, Tina's movie has been all but ignored by JFK researchers. In it, she captures the limousine as it turns from Houston onto Elm Street. More importantly, she may have captured President Kennedy reacting to the first shot that was fired that day, several seconds before Abraham Zapruder had even begun to film. Her film captured the limousine as it passed in front of the Daltex building, which was across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. As the limousine makes that turn, President Kennedy begins to wave to the crowd. But then something rather strange happened. He starts to wave to the crowd, but then within half a second, he pulls his hand back and balls it into a fist. Please watch closely and keep in mind that this is in extreme slow motion. Each frame lasts for about 1/18 of a second. And then something else happened that was pretty strange. The film was damaged, and approximately 7 frames were destroyed. It was during those 7 missing frames that President Kennedy fell sharply to his left. Because the frames were deleted, we aren't able to see it happen, but we can easily see him straighten back up. And this is not an optical illusion. Compare President Kennedy's motion with Jackie and the other people in the car. He's the
And there, my folks, you can see why you do not see the full Zapruder film. That's why you only see it turns on right when the car is already on Elm Street.
only one who reacts this way. Okay, so JFK starts to raise his right hand to wave to the crowd, but then suddenly he pulls it back and balls his hand into a fist, and then he falls sharply to his left, and then he straightens back up. There had to be a reason for that. There had to be a cause. According to Gary Mack at the Sixth Floor Museum, Tina Towner said that no one in her family knows when or how those frames were destroyed. So if Tina's family didn't damage the film, then it must have happened while it was in the FBI's possession. Over the years, I've examined every available film to try to find one that would give us a better look at JFK's reaction then. I almost found it in the film taken by Robert Hughes, which also captured the limousine as it made that turn onto Elm Street. It was taken from a greater distance, but the original frames could be blown up and would very likely show JFK's movement then. But guess what happened? The film was damaged at exactly the same point in time that Tina's film was damaged. So it appears that the FBI destroyed frames in both the Towner and the Hughes films, which depicted the same fraction of a second in which President Kennedy reacted to that first shot. Now, if that wasn't done deliberately, then at the very least, it proves that they were certainly interested in those frames, enough so that they stopped the film to examine them long enough to let them burn up. Many theorists, including most of the government defenders, believe that an early shot struck the pavement, which explains why some witnesses recall seeing sparks flying up from the road. That would suggest that President Kennedy could have been pelted by small pieces of asphalt or metal. But in spite of his reaction, the president doesn't appear to be too concerned. He seems to have felt something, but like the others around him, he didn't hear anything that he perceived to be a gunshot. In fact, Tina Towner stated that she never heard a gunshot until sometime after she stopped filming. So, one of two things happened. The president's reactions were either caused by something other than a gunshot, or they were the result of a gunshot that no one heard. This is an overhead view of the intersection of Houston and Elm Street. Notice the positions of Tina Towner, the Texas School Book Depository, and the Daltex building. I've also illustrated the positions of the limousine as it made that very sharp turn onto Elm. What I believe I can demonstrate is that the earliest shots that day were fired from the third floor of the Daltex building. We get a good look at that building and the windows facing down Elm Street in this photo taken by James Altgens. I used to believe that the shots came from behind the fire escape, but I think I was mistaken about that. The angle for the shots as the limo turned onto Elm Street would actually be better from the southernmost window facing west down Elm. If we blow up this very high-resolution copy of the Altgens photo and bring up the contrast a bit, we make an extremely interesting discovery about that window. Look closely.
Hold on.
Part of that window has been broken out. As we see in other windows, the glass looks a bit grayish, probably because the windows are dusty. But in places where there is no glass, the area looks darker. And the location of that broken area is fully consistent with where a shooter sitting a few feet back from the window would want it to be. In 1963, there were only a few offices on that third floor, and much of it was used to store boxes, so it would have been easy to set up a sniper's nest similar to the one in the depository. Only one professional criminal was apprehended in Dealey Plaza that day. His name was Jim Braden, and he was discovered on the third floor of the Daltex building. When he was first questioned, Braden admitted that he was in the Daltex building during the assassination. But after he was taken to the sheriff's office, he changed his story, claiming that he was only there after the shooting had ended. He later told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he was visiting his parole officer during the assassination, a claim that his parole officer, Roger Carroll, refused to confirm. We'll be talking more about Braden later. This is a photo taken from the Daltex building looking west down Elm Street. The view and the angles from there are absolutely perfect. But being in such an excellent location, how could the shooter have missed and hit the pavement? Well, I'm going to answer that question for you, but first let me ask you a question. If you were that sniper and you just missed the entire limousine, what would you do next? That's right, you'd fire again, wouldn't you? Shortly after Tina stopped shooting, Abraham Zapruder turned on his camera. To see when the next shot was fired, we'll be...
Now, there's where a lot of people are being misled. Abraham Zapruder never shut his camera off. I witnessed the entire film. So that is a false statement. It's been fed out to the people, fed out to whoever's investigating, who never had the opportunity I did, but my son was able to look it up on the internet and found out that that documentary exists at KCOP 13, Channel 13 in Los Angeles.
Looking at extreme blow-ups of the earliest parts of that film. Notice the president dropping his right hand. Shortly after frame 165, we will see a sequence of movements by the President and Mrs. Kennedy, which I believe are quite significant.
I do too, because I think at that point he has spotted the umbrella, and he's probably spotted the Cuban with his fist up in the air with a black glove on. So he sees that. He's reacting to what he's seeing ahead of him.
At this point, Mrs. Kennedy, who would later testify that she was looking to her left when she heard the first noise, begins to turn toward her husband. Like many other witnesses, Mrs. Kennedy was adamant that the first noise didn't sound at all like a gunshot. Also, please pay close attention to President Kennedy's hands, which he has brought to rest together. His fingers at this point are interlaced. At the same time that Mrs. Kennedy begins to react, the President starts to separate his hands, which have been together for only 15 frames, or 5/6 of 1 second. Mrs. Kennedy continues to turn toward her husband. But look at the President's hands now. In particular, look at the fingers of his left hand, which had been interlaced with his right hand. The President raised his right hand before he even separated it from his left, causing him to pull his left hand upward by several inches, and the fingers of his left hand to be splayed and pointing straight up. Before high-resolution versions of the Zapruder film were available to the public, most researchers believed that JFK was smiling in frame 180. But when we zoom in and get a better look at him, I don't think there's much doubt that we're seeing a grimace rather than a smile. In the next clear frame, we see that as he raised his hand, JFK was simultaneously twisting to his right. By frame 193, he has turned more than 90 degrees to his right and is clearly shielding his face with his right hand. Notice also that Mrs. Kennedy has turned completely to her right, exactly as she said she did in response to that first noise. So by this point in time, we seem to have seen two distinct reactions by President Kennedy. Now, if those were caused by gunshots, then the shooter did exactly what we would expect him to do. He fired again, and with exactly the same result, he missed. When I first heard the theory that one shot missed the entire limousine and struck the pavement, I didn't believe it. I mean, how could anybody shoot that badly? But if we look into what is really the only plausible explanation for how this could have happened, it all starts to make sense. Weapons expert Mark White wrote an article for Small Arms Review magazine, which also appeared at the Guns.Connect website. In it, Mr. White discussed problems associated with the use of noise suppressors on rifles. As Mr. White points out, suppressors, also known as silencers, are notorious for causing misfires, because even the tiniest misalignment can cause gunshots to go wildly off course. His article came out 35 years after the assassination, but even then, many silencers were having serious problems. In addition to the problems of misalignment, some suppressors were still using baffles that also caused shots to go astray. Keep in mind that White was talking about professionally manufactured suppressors that were decades more advanced than what was available in 1963, and silencers used by the Mafia were frequently homemade devices which were even less reliable. White, who was writing mainly for the law enforcement community, also pointed out that no enforcement officer in his right mind would ever assemble a rifle on the spot on a call out of a crime scene and expect the weapon to hold its.
Yeah, and that's what we're to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald did, was assemble his rifle on the 6th floor of the depository building. He assembled it and got these good shots, right? Right.
Zero. He said it might, but such an occurrence would be an abnormality. Of course, no assassin would risk being spotted carrying a fully assembled rifle and suppressor into Dealey Plaza. He would have had to plan on assembling it after he got there, making his weapon all the more unstable. Folks, if this was any other crime in history, and the shooter missed his target that badly, wouldn't the first suspicion be that the sniper was having a problem with his rifle? But there's an even better reason to believe that a faulty suppressor was used to fire the early shots. Shortly after that last reaction, the president was clearly hit by a bullet. Now, if I'm correct, this was the third shot. The most common belief among researchers in the past is that this was the second. And yet the large majority of witnesses that day said they only heard one early shot and then closely bunched shots at the very end. So of all the early shots, only one was actually noticed by most witnesses. And most witnesses who described that first audible shot said that it sounded much different than the ones they heard later. Special Agent Roy Kellerman testified that the first sound he heard was similar to a firecracker exploding in the area to the rear of the car. Like the other witnesses, he heard nothing at all following that first noise until the end of the attack, when he heard a flurry of shells come into the car. When our inspector asked him if those final gunshots sounded different from that first sound he heard, he replied, yes, definitely, very much so. Mrs. Connolly first heard a noise which she did not recognize as a gunshot. Then she looked back and saw the president obviously reacting to being hit. She went on to testify that she heard two more shots after that, one of which she mistakenly believed wounded her husband. We'll be talking more about that shortly. Like Mrs. Connolly, Mrs. Kennedy first heard a noise which she did not believe was a gunshot. We'll be talking more about her also. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood also confirmed that the first shot he heard was different and more like a firecracker than the last shots. Secret Service agent George Hickey, riding in the car behind the president, said that the final two shots he heard were completely different than the first one. Hickey also stated that the first shot sounded like it came from ground level, which suggests that what really made that shot audible was the fact that it shattered when it struck the pavement. Reporter James Underwood described the first noise this way. I thought it was an explosion. I've heard many rifles fired, but it did not sound like a rifle to me. I believe I said to one of the other fellows, it sounds like a giant firecracker. Witness James Tay described that first noise this way. About this time I heard what sounded like a firecracker. Well, a very loud firecracker. It certainly didn't sound like a rifle shot. Texas Governor John Connally, on the other hand, testified that he thought the first shot really did sound like a gunshot. Warren Commissioner Alan Dulles responded, "You and one other happen to be the only witnesses who have indicated that they recognize it as being a rifle shot. Most of the witnesses have indicated they thought it was a backfire. The first shot was a backfire or a firecracker." Okay, let's see if we can make sense out of all this. The limo proceeds to the intersection of Houston and Elm. Just as it appears in front of the Daltex building, the sniper aims at the president's head and fires. But the suppressor on his weapon causes the bullet to go astray and strike the pavement to the right of the limousine. Although not totally silent, the sound was weak enough that it was drowned out by the crowd noise and went unnoticed. A few seconds later he fires again, but the same thing happens. Only this time the shot made an audible sound when it hit the pavement, and perhaps because the crowd noise had diminished, it was heard by many of the witnesses. The sniper makes one last try. By now he realizes that his shots are being pulled to the right, so he adjusts, sighting his weapon to the left of the president's head. But he has no way of knowing how to adjust his shot vertically. So instead of hitting the head, his bullet strikes the president in the upper back.
All right, I'm going to end this here. Some of it's a little bit off, the way I feel about it, but if you want to watch the whole documentary, it's on YouTube, and it's pretty interesting. There's some other bits and pieces of this documentary that are pretty interesting to what I showed here. So I'm going to end this here, and hopefully you got some good information out of this.